Polarization in particular, probably one of the big ways it hurts political trust is it creates gridlock in the United States because of the kind of electoral system that we have. So if polarization drives gridlock and then gridlock makes people feel that government isn't responding to their interests, then they're going to trust the government less. So that's what I mean by the distrust divergence hypothesis, that trust and divergence or trust and polarization are in a causal feedback loop, a doom loop, so to speak. And that what we have to do is figure out ways to interrupt the divergence, distrust.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and today we are very pleased to be having a civilized discussion about a very important civics topic, trust in a polarized age, right before an election as well. Americans are finding it harder and harder to trust one another. According to the latest research by Pew and the Knight Foundation, not only has our social trust plummeted, but our trust in government has dropped so dramatically that 28% of those polled expressed no confidence in government at all. More sadly, this distrust ferments into hatred, which hardens and divides people further and can morph into something more sinister. So what's happening to us as a nation? How do we get ourselves into this political and philosophical predicament? Is it something new for America? And what can we do to fix the problem? Well, to help us understand this better, we have two individuals today with super keen knowledge of the subject, Professors Kevin Vallier and Jane Mansbridge. So we're going to start first with you, Kevin. Kevin is a philosophy professor at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and he's authored several books, Must Politics Be War, and his latest, Trust in a Polarized Age. So welcome, Kevin, and tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it down right now.
So I started working on trust and polarization about 5 years ago because I was interested in a certain kind of challenge to liberal democracy. So there's a philosophical challenge which says that, look, any political order is essentially a war. It's just the violence is sublimated. So there's a certain view of politics that just says, look, all it is an attempt by different competing interest groups to conquer one another. And I admitted that in the US, that's kind of how things look. But in Must Politics Be War, my first book, I argued that this purely philosophical challenge was incorrect. But I also wanted to know whether we were stuck in this predicament in practice in the United States, because those are different questions, right? Maybe politics doesn't have to be war, but maybe it does here. And so my book that's coming out, Trust in a Polarized Age, gets knee deep into research on both trust and polarization to try to suggest ways of making polarization less destructive by restoring trust in each other and in our institutions. So that's the basic project of the book.
So polarization, just as a theme, do you think that part of the problem is that we don't have enough political parties in this country? There isn't enough pluralism.
Yeah, I think that the fact that we have only two parties makes polarization a lot easier to reach and to get to. And I think also that, if we had red, blue, and yellow, right, it would, I think, be a healthier polity in a way. But I also think that a lot of the issues with polarization are coming from the bottom up, that Americans disagree about things that they didn't always disagree about. And that when we were in, say, the World War II period, a lot of our disagreements were sublimated because we were focused on something bigger. But during, post-war prosperity, all these new kinds of issues, race, abortion, the sexual revolution came up and created real differences that I think got manifested in our politics, particularly when Southern realignment occurred, which, basically was when the South went from being Democratic to Republican. For many decades, the Republican Party had no basic infrastructure in the South. And so it was harder for Southern opinion to get expressed. But as soon as realignment occurred, we got in more increasing sort of red versus blue attitudes that I think reveal some degree of disagreement in the public as a whole. But I do think there's, in particular, a lot of polarization among elites for a variety of reasons. And that can have its effect on most people. So I think there's a bottom-up element of where we are. And then there's a a top-down element. It's with respect to polarization. But I also think it's tracking lower trust levels, both lower trust in each other, which I call social trust, and lower trust in institutions or government, which I call political trust. So what I've sort of tried to do in the book is give a couple of different theories about how these two phenomena are related. And so what I do is develop something what I call the distrust divergence hypothesis. So divergence is just the term I use to cover both polarization, where we disagree with each other more, or we're more emotionally divided, and sorting, as maybe we move somewhere with people who are like-minded. Maybe we only spend time with people who are like-minded. So we're diverging in terms of our feelings, we're diverging in terms of our attitudes. And so what I've tried to do is put together an account of how these two phenomena, falling trust and increasing polarization, might be increasing one another. And I can go through a few of those. I could go through a few of those connections if it would be of interest.
I'd like you to do that. But first I wanted to ask you, it seems to me that since we now no longer have the daily newspaper and most people are getting their information from the phone, has this not really accelerated the process of division? Because now it's very easy just to hang out with all your buddies in one of these chat rooms and, and never talk or even hear the opposition. And it's not even the opposition, it's just someone that doesn't agree entirely with you. So we use these very divisive terms, don't we? So how much is social media responsible for this divergence?
Some of the research I've seen is a little surprising. It turns out the stuff that's diverging people the most is probably cable TV news. So at least on Facebook, there'll be your uncle who has some wacky view that you think is terrible, but you encounter the view, right? So it depends on, compared to what, right? Social media, I think, is actually better than cable TV news, but it's worse than, I think, things like newspapers. It's hard to say. I also think that Facebook is probably better than Twitter, because I think Twitter is set up for people to kind of dunk on each other. Whereas, Facebook isn't always friendly, but it can be a friendlier place. So I think a lot of it depends on the particular type of media and the incentives it gives people to disagree or agree.
Okay, so you wanted to go back to the book. Somebody's come in right away and said, I think it all started with Fox News and the end of the fairness doctrine. So, which is probably true.
I think there's definitely something called the Fox News effect, which does increase Republican vote share by a few points. But I think that's actually a pretty small part of what's going on. Because political polarization has been increasing since before Fox News started in 1996. And the same thing with falling trust. And indeed, AM radio does drive a lot of politics and political opinion. But again, it just doesn't go back far enough in time to cover what's going on. So, what the connections between, I think, trust and polarization work a little bit like this. Trusting people, that is, people who trust one another, tend to adopt fewer extreme policies. So there's some very new data on this, that when you trust other people, you listen to them, and maybe you'll be convinced. So it can produce preference moderation. And low trust people tend to have more extreme opinions and often adopt more conspiracy theories. Social trust helps people to focus more on common interests because they aren't afraid of other people, so they feel like they can focus on the public good. It also facilitates redistribution to reduce or compress economic inequalities. So if social trust leads people to think, look, if I'm rich and my money goes to the poor aren't going to waste it. I trust them not to waste it. So I think that when falling social trust does produce polarization there, falling trust in government also creates problems. Here's one way that I think things are going. When political trust falls, populist voting tends to increase. And I think people say, look, the people in power are corrupt. Let's, drain the swamp, right? But then the populist politicians come in and they're often quite corrupt. And that, I think, tends to decrease trust and increase polarization as well. So trust will fall, polarization will rise, populism will follow. So that's how I think trust causes polarization, and falling trust increases polarization. There's also the reverse phenomenon. where it's harder to look at the data and pull out patterns here. But one thing I think that's going on is that polarization makes outgroup cues more salient, right? So red and blue now have different costumes, so to speak, different different uniforms, right? Different bumper stickers and different kinds of cars that they drive. So more polarization says, look, these people are actually pretty different from me. Maybe I should be suspicious of them. Falling political trust increases corruption. And that can reduce social trust. It's one of the few things that we're pretty confident reduces social trust. Falling political trust can lead to populist voting, which can lead to corruption. Polarization in particular, probably one of the big ways it hurts political trust is it creates gridlock in the United States because of the kind of electoral system that we have. So if polarization drives gridlock, and then gridlock makes people feel that government isn't responding to their interests, then they're going to trust the government less. So that's what I mean by the distrust divergence hypothesis, that trust and divergence, or trust and polarization, are in a causal feedback loop, a doom loop, so to speak. And that what we have to do is figure out ways to interrupt the divergence distrust loop.
You were describing people having the same cars and same outfits and sort of uniform. This sounds very like tribalism to me, rather than, is it akin to tribalism on some level?
You know, I mean, I've been doing some reading on the evolution of our moral sense, and it actually seems like tribes were more cooperative with themselves and than our groups are. So we might be being hard on tribes, but it's possible.
Well, maybe a replacement for tribalism.
Yeah. Well, it's actually probably maybe worse in some respects what we've got, because we have such a vicious attitude towards other groups, right? Like being a member of a tribe doesn't mean that you hate the other tribe, but for us, it does.
I suppose, although they did have warfare, tribal warfare, didn't they?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. No, that's certain. I mean, that's certainly true. One is declining religious identity. So you don't have as much, as large of a part of your life that you can invest in other people without politics coming up. Right. So having cross-cutting identities that aren't purely political. You know, they talk about in the media about evangelical support for Trump, but the way evangelicals often measured is they just ask you, are you evangelical? They don't ask you how often you go to church, for instance. So this means someone could just identify the role because of a religious experience they have when they're 16, but they watch 10 times as much Fox News as they spend in church. So a lot of these labels are even misleading because the political identities are becoming the more salient ones. This is clearest where, 50 years ago, people didn't want their children to marry someone with a different race, right? A huge number of people, a large proportion of the country. Now that's fallen dramatically, but political differences replaced it. There's lots of Democratic families who say, no, don't marry a Republican, and lots in reverse. So it's a kind of tribalism that involves distrust, suspicion, and hate. That seems to be just amplifying itself.
Wow. Just a question came in on this topic from Rita. I think it goes back to education, for which the standards have been declining since the late 60s. If one can parse information and has no critical thinking skills, the decline of education corresponds with an increase in extremist individualism, fundamentalism, and political distrust. Somebody has said this.
I mean, it's a curious, interesting list that you gave. Actually, we've seen more polarization with less fundamentalism. And I think what's going on is we're becoming political fundamentalists instead of religious fundamentalists. So that's the problem that we seek. It's funny, read an editorial in the New York Times some years ago, and it made the point that you may not like the Christian right, but the post-Christian right might be worse, right? So this is the difference, say, between George W. Bush and Donald Trump. The one seemed to be, pious, and the other, obviously, not in any sense of the term. And you might think there's some ways in which that's actually worse. Because at least with religion, you could say, well, look, we have the same faith, but we disagree on politics, but that's okay because we have the same faith. But if you don't have any other identities, right, then, you know, your own desire to fight, you know, to win conflicts with other people, to defeat them, all the books that are dedicated towards getting people to be able to win arguments with their family members at Thanksgiving. Like there's a lot, like a subgenre of pop political literature that's about defeating your family members in political argument when you see them once a year. And I think that's horrible. I think it's completely immoral to do that. So I think this is what we're seeing, is everything's becoming about politics, and that's a big thing that's driving our problems.
Last note, Greta has written, there is a beautiful bipartisan movement in the US to reunite Americans, and a film called The Reunited States. Have you heard of this movement? And she's given a link there if anybody wants to take the
No,
link.
I haven't. I have heard of some legislative efforts to try to address certain kinds of issues, like campaign finance reform proposals, and the For the People Act that the House passed last year, that I think will help if it gets passed by a Democratic administration. But no, I'm not familiar with that particular movement. Just legislative bills.
Okay, so we're going to move over to Jane. Jane, known as Jenny Mansbridge, is a Harvard political scientist and one of the most respected voices, as well as the most popular teachers on democratic theory. She's currently Adams Professor of Political Leadership and Democratic Values Emeritus at the Kennedy School. And in 2018, she received the Johann Schutter Prize in Political Science, which is the equivalent of a Nobel Prize. She supports the idea of unitary democracy, where, quote, deliberation, in contrast to slogans, shouting, and Twitter outbursts, requires questioning others and listening hard to them. Okay, well, your advice couldn't have come at a better time, Jenny, after last night's debate.
So I'd like to talk just a little bit about the way this polarization came about. I agree with Kevin that after World War II, we saw a decline of unity within the United States and a rise of very difficult problems. I'm a feminist, and I understand how what problems the feminist movement caused for lots of people. And I wrote a book called Why We Lost the ERA, which suggests that one of the reasons we lost the ERA was that we feminists didn't listen hard enough to what other people were saying. So I'm going to be stressing listening in what I say, but I also want to look at the political institutions behind our failures, our increasing failures to listen. So I'm going to talk about a couple of causes of polarization and some things that might help. One of the causes that Kevin's mentioned, the very deep cause, obviously, is that in 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And at that point, the Southern conservatives began to leave the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party. And so that meant that the Republican Party became more and more conservative. The Democratic Party became somewhat more liberal, but not as much more liberal as the Democratic Party became conservative. And in the South, it became more liberal because the only people left who were Democrat, not the only people, but a large number of the people who were left were in the South who were Democrats were African Americans, a relatively liberal group politically. But overall, in the country as a whole, the Democrats didn't become a great deal more liberal. The Republicans became a great deal more conservative. So that's one thing that I think we all know about. Another thing that's less well known is that, and Frances Lee wrote about this in a wonderful book called Insecure Majorities. She pointed out that this period that we look back on as bipartisanship and so forth was really a period in which the Democrats held all the power. There was only one time since after the war, in fact, considerably going back to 1932, only one time that the Republicans actually had the House, had the Senate. So what did the Republican politicians face? They faced a world governed by Democrats. In fact, political scientists called this the sun-moon institutional setup. They expected America to run like this, with one party as the sun and the other party as the moon. The Republicans were the moon. So if the other party is going to run things, just to get your bridges and harbors, you kind of can't be too obstreperous. You've got to make relatively nice to the more powerful party. And the Democrats, for their part, were divided. So the Democratic liberals would reach out to make common cause with the Republican liberals, and the Democratic conservatives would reach out to make common cause with the Republican conservatives. Now, the sentiment in the country changed, and accordingly, the Republicans got more and more power, and finally in 1980, they were actually able to manage to capture the Senate. And after that time, it was up, down, up, down. It was very, very competitive. Every single election, it could go either for the Democrats or it could go for the Republicans. It was a razor sharp close. So in those circumstances, far from making nice, it pays you to kill your opponents, because only that way can you get a majority in the next election. A majority was the whole thing. So that's the kind of electoral system we have. So after that, each party had the incentive to try to undermine the others. They undermine the character of the people on the other side, undermine the party, and win. And people who had been there for the earlier kind of era often retired. They say, this isn't what I joined up to do. I don't like these politics. So those are two things, both the changing party composition, but also this competitive closeness starting in 1980. And that's what we've been living with since 1980. There is another possible explanation, which is inequality. Things were very unequal back in the days of the robber barons, and they got more and more unequal, and then in the more equal, and then in the 1950s, we had a lovely period of relative equality, and then starting around 1980, inequality began to go up. So you've got a U curve of inequality. What happens that the U curve of polarization tracks that very closely. Back in the robber baron days, it was also very polarized. Then post-World War II, much less polarized. And then just as inequality was going up, so did polarization go up. So maybe inequality is causing polarization. And some political scientists think that's the case. There are a few problems with that. One is that polarization came first, and you don't usually expect the effect to come before the cause, but also that Bob Putnam has shown that there are all sorts of trends that take this U-shaped curve. Union membership was low. This is a reverse curve, low and then became high and now is getting low. All sorts of other things, philanthropy and so forth. So he calls this a problem of moving from the I and the robber baron days to the we of the post-war period to the current I period. Now, that suggests that it's not inequality that's the cause. So we have these deep structural causes. It's not just a matter of being nice. It's not just a matter of you're listening to the person in your family who has different views and paying a lot more attention, which I completely advocate, by the way. I advocate listening, but it's not just a matter of what we individuals do. It's a matter of some of these deeper structural causes. Is there something we could do about that? Well, we're in a pretty tough shape because, as Kevin said and Mary said, lots of Democrats think that Republicans are a threat to the nation's well-being, and lots of Democrats think that they don't want to have their kids marry a Republican. Lots of Republicans say they don't want to have their kids marry Democrats. In fact, back in 1960, only 4% of Democrats were worried about their children marrying somebody else. Only 5% of Republicans. This is a minuscule number. But now, at least in 2016, 60% of Democrats wouldn't want their kid to marry somebody in the opposite party, and 63% of Republicans. This is a huge shift in regard to the negative feelings we have about people in the opposite party. So what might help? I'm going to suggest 3 things that maybe people haven't thought about that try to get at the structural causes. One is simply teaching those who make the laws in our country, both in the state legislatures and in Congress, teaching them how to negotiate better. And negotiating better doesn't mean just bluffing like poker and being the most aggressive person at the table. Good negotiation, if you take one of the courses that is given in law schools or given in business schools or given in public policy schools all around the country, these very, very popular courses, they're popular because they teach people things they can use. The big lesson that people teach is how to look for the interest behind the positions. I come in, I say, I want X, and X is very expensive for you. So you try to figure out by asking questions and listening hard, why do you want X? What are your underlying interests? How? And then if you find out what their underlying interests are, is there some way that I can meet those interests in another way that isn't so costly for me? That's the makings of a great negotiator. Trying to find out what is it that you really want? What can I give you that isn't necessarily what you asked for, but it'll be less costly? And Mary Parker Follett, by the way, I just want to say she invented this concept of negotiation back in 1925. Don't forget Mary Parker Follett, remember that name. So it's called integrative agreement. And to get there, you have to ask these genuine questions. So what we've done at the Kennedy School is we've taken the courses that are given in negotiation, which almost all use business examples and sometimes use a little bit of international relations examples, but that's it. They never use legislative examples. And we've translated all of these ideas from 40 years of negotiation theory into what legislators can use. And we've developed cases and simulations that we've made public to any instructor wanting to teach legislative negotiation. And in fact, the Library of Congress is using our cases and simulations and using professors from the Kennedy School and teaching congressional staff and members of Congress how to negotiate better, how to listen. For example, the Appropriations Committee has gotten gung-ho on this and said, you know, yes, let's have all our staff on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats are very interested in how we can teach negotiation better. So I think this is a small step, but it's a step very much in the right direction of getting our legislators to talk to one another and understand each other's interests. And so I think perhaps I'm coming to the end of my time. There's 2 other things that I might suggest. One is something called the civic lottery, and that means you take a random selection of citizens, you bring them together for a weekend, sometimes longer, to discuss issues that are hot topics. And believe it or not, those citizens sometimes come up with original ideas and often, usually, move toward a more moderate position. So that in a very recent one, you can look it up on the web, America in One Room, which brought about 500 people together in Texas to talk about big issues in America. At the end, the Republicans had gotten more closer to the Democratic position on immigration, support for forcing undocumented immigrants to return home has fallen way below it was 79% when they came in, 40% when they left. And the Democrats were realizing that a lot of these programs cost money and beginning to worry about and began to change their positions on support for some of the Democratic issues, particularly the ones that cost a lot of money. So now, of course, I'm a Democrat, so I'm sad that the Democrats changed their minds, but the point is that they changed their minds after listening to other citizens, and that they moved toward the center. And we can do this with representatives. Representatives can gather a randomly selected group of their constituents, not the kind of self-selected people who go to these town halls, but a really representative random sample. Representatives can talk to that sample and find out how their constituents really think, not just the ones who are screaming, but the ones who usually aren't doing any screaming, who are just thinking at home and wondering what to do. Representatives can listen to those. So that's another way that we can introduce into our democracy. And finally, we could have an ideal, I call it recursive representation, and that just means that representatives of all sorts can get into a recursive relationship with their constituents, where they listen to the constituents, so the constituents listen to them, they listen again to the constituents listen again to them, and it goes round and round in a dynamic feedback loop, a way of listening to one another and responding, listening to one another and responding. You get lots and lots of representatives meeting their constituents, but it's at the best in these town hall meetings, which is two-way, which means that one person shouts at the other and the other person tries to give some kind of explanation, or one person says something and it gets a response, but it's not back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's not what I call recursive. So I think if we had that as an ideal, we could begin to invent institutions that actually put that into the ideal. So those are three things in which we look at our institutions and we say, what changes can we make at the edges of our present institutions without having a constitutional convention? What changes can we make that'll get people to listen more carefully to one another? So that's where I come off. Thanks.
Well, they're really positive, those suggestions.
Would it be all right if I just
jump in?
Just to make a remark on this. I mean, I agree with everything that Jenny has said. But what I would add to that is that I do think there are some institutional reforms that could raise trust. And that if we can raise trust, we can reduce polarization, or at least reduce its more negative effects. I mean, think about it. If we all trust each other, but we disagree a lot, right? We could find ways to deal with that. But if we don't trust each other very much, polarization can be extremely destructive. So I think part of the story, and I think what Jenny's talking about would work for trust as well, because I think there's a lot of evidence that positive contact with other people increases trust. But I do think there's some policy reforms that we can look at. One of my favorite ones is actually real estate reform or land reform, making it easier to build new housing in cities. Now, here's why I think this can help. It's first estimated that this could increase economic growth considerably, because you could have a lot more workers in the city engaged in a lot more productive work. So economic growth goes up, and people politically trust more when they feel like they're prospering. That's more of something that people on the right would emphasize, but people on the left would emphasize more, say, the importance of equality for trust in government. But you also get more equality from this proposal, because the people with really high real estate values, now, they have poorer workers living close to them. So the real estate values will come closer together. So this is a policy where you can get more economic growth, more economic equality at the same time. And everyone can come away and feel like, oh, wow, the government's performing better, even from my own political perspective. So the hope is to find policy changes and these sort of deliberative changes, and to hopefully be doing them at the same time.
Interesting thought. Okay, this is just an aside, but it's just interesting to me. You direct the PPE Center at the Bowling Green State, Kevin. PPE's politics, philosophy, and economics, which is very common in Europe for politicians to actually go that route before they go in, run for election. So apart from me looking at the current candidate, resident in the White House, who seems to have little or no training in anything, do you think, in conjunction with the negotiation skills that they seem to lack a lot of the politicians currently, do you think that if they studied a little more philosophy and had a broader view of things, they could connect between voting and the actual repercussions in society? They'd actually have a social context.
Well, that's rosy. And as a philosopher, I would love for it to be true. The thing that I worry about is that philosophy alone actually makes people, I think, more ideological. That's why I like PPE so much, is that it forces philosophers to engage political science and economics. So, I think you need to have both. Philosophy helps you to think more rigorously about, morality and principles of justice. And then the politics and economics help you to understand how institutions actually work so that things won't backfire when you try to reform them. So yeah, I would add philosophy to politics and economics. I think that will certainly help. We just want to be careful not to do philosophy all by itself.
Do you agree with that, Jenny?
Yes, I do. I think that training in philosophy is extremely important. And I didn't intend to become a philosopher, but turned out that I ended up working in democratic theory, because the more and more you push things, the more it looks as if getting our ideals clear is a very good way of getting our actions clear. So I definitely subscribe to trying to have a bit more philosophical training. Do you think, Mary, I could be a little critical of something you just said?
Yeah, sure. Something about...
You said that the current occupant of the White House has no training in anything. You know that's an exaggeration, and you said it sort of for fun. Oh, I mean,
in the fields we're talking about.
But I think, and before I made a big point of how it's our institutions, but I do think that we should also be try as hard as we can to kind of extend some listening capacity to the other side. Now I abhor President Trump. I think that he's done not only a terrible job, I think he's a very bad human being. Nevertheless, I think that I wouldn't describe him as having no training in anything. And so, and I think, the people on the left talk about repugs, and people on the right talk about libtards. And I think that kind of language, I hope that as we move forward in our country, and as we move forward into a more united approach to our politics, I hope that we'll not only try to change our institutions to make them help the country listen to one another, help our representatives listen to one another. I hope we'll watch our own little ways of thinking. So I'm sorry about jumping on that.
I really was meaning it in the context of what we was discussing, which is learning philosophy.
Certainly no training in philosophy. I think it's probably quite correct to say
and
that
negotiation.
There's no training in philosophy.
Huge for everyone.
I mean, one useful way to kind of set back from Trump is to see him, I think, is the outcome of a certain kind of distrust and divergence, where people on the right just said, look, the whole left is corrupt, bad. They have been in power forever, and we need to kick them out. And this movement, kind of populist attitude, you also find on the left in many cases, like for instance from Bernie Sanders, the thought that we need to put an outsider on the inside to sort of clean things up and make government more trustworthy and less corrupt. Now, whether that actually happens, we can look at the case on the left in South America and on the right in the United States to see that, well, maybe it doesn't always sort of work that way. But I think if we take a kind of broader perspective and see Trump as much of an effect as a cause, which I think he's clearly both, then I think it becomes easier to depolarize in a way. So, when I when I think about Trump, I think one thing. When I think about Trump supporters, I think in a very different way. And I think we probably all agreed on that. So.
Right. We've got two interesting comments. Greta says, isn't the shift in polarization partly due to people waking up to social inequity, misogyny, and racism in the 60s and 70s? More people accepted these divides before the social revolution of the 60s and 70s.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And so that's the question, isn't it? Is there is there a way of moving toward greater justice and greater fairness without causing the kind of tremendous backlash that we've had? And maybe the answer is there is no such way, in which case, plow ahead. But I think that, as I showed you, that some of the causes that are in the background that have nothing to do with those inequalities, the civil rights movement did, but the other thing of the parties becoming more competitive may not have had something to do with that. It might have had something to do with that. Actually, I'm just thinking anew for the first time as I say this. It's possible that the reason, and I'm really thinking this for the very first time, but it's possible that the Republican Party, the support for the Republican Party may have grown, and the number of people who call themselves conservative in the United States may have grown as a reaction to the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the gay movement, in ways that were not necessarily absolutely direct. I hate them, and so I'm going to be turned into become a Republican, but perhaps more direct, a greater and greater sense that people who are not like me are sort of getting control, and therefore things are unsettled. You know, I would have to think this through a little bit more, but it's possible that even my second structural second structural cause had something to do with reaction. Probably did have something to do with reaction against these inequalities. However, I don't think that we are stuck with the results, as Kevin, I think, would say, and as I say.
One point that I would add, and it's something I become fascinated by, but I don't know how to explain, is asymmetric secularization in the United States. In Western Europe, secularization seems to have been pretty even across the board for the most part politically. But what happened between the 60s and the 80s is that the religious left seems to have collapsed. And so one of our cleavages now is kind of being religious. If you're on the right, you know, maybe you're religious. If you're on the left, maybe not. Unless, of course, you're African American, in which case that just it's a very, you know, that's a counterexample. But among whites, in particular, what you find is a kind of more secular Democrat. And so part of the polarization is this, you know, level of religiosity. And the sense that the country is moving away from Christianity. So, you know, I think there are definitely parts of the story that are reactions to equality movements. But I also think part of the story has to do with just worrying about secularization and its negative consequences. So it isn't just a reaction to, and a kind of reaction to equality, but I also think it's a reaction to the decline of Christianity. And I think those aren't necessarily the same thing. So I just add that in the mix.
People are asking here about ideas for policy reforms. Now, when I spoke to you earlier, you said that I'd ask both of you if you thought we could have a coup after this election. If the result is either way, there could be a coup, but there could certainly be a lot more unrest on the streets, understandably, because it's waiting for something to happen. And if it doesn't happen, I don't know what will. You seem pretty confident that the system is intact and that change is possible through the democratic process with our existing apparatus of government. Even though I have my concerns about this. I mean, I certainly worry about the Electoral College. I worry a great deal about the way the Supreme Court is stacked now. One suggestion, I know that's one big question, is to take things like abortion, which perennially come around in this country under the religious umbrella, and make them non-religious. And, you know, they shouldn't be dealt with in the Supreme Court. This should be something that's voted on in a referendum like it was in Ireland, which is one of the most Catholic countries in the world, and it passed. So your apparatus is very odd here in some ways for dealing with solving a problem. You create a problem like abortion, and then it goes round and round and round the Supreme Court. And then you have these lifelong people on the court, and you can't get rid of them. So do you really think that we can make sufficient change within the boundaries of the system right now to satisfy people and make real progress?
Well, a lot's going to depend on the kind of Supreme Court reform that would be proposed. I do think that it would have been much better to deal with abortion at the congressional level in the way that basically all of Europe did. And they came up with compromises, even in the less religious countries, so that the Democratic position on legal third trimester abortions is to the left of many Europeans. So I think that it's been polarized all around the Supreme Court and being focused on these elite people and creating elite minds that had certain ideologies, right? Or, originalism, textualism, purposivism, and so on. Instead of just saying, let's just talk this out, right? And bring people together and figure out what we can do. And it may be the case that it would be better to deal with abortion politics at the state level. Although I think for folks on the left, there's a difficult trade-off. On the one hand, you want to protect women's reproductive rights as much as you can. On the other hand, imagine what would happen to the Republican Party at the national level if they didn't have abortion in their quiver. There's a lot of pro-life Catholics that are on the left economically. And I think if it weren't for Roe, we might have universal health care by now.
That's right.
So I don't know that, but I think it's a trade-off really worth sort of focusing on, because that's life. There are these trade-offs. So deciding things at the Supreme Court level, I think, has been mostly pretty bad. And if the proposals that are proposed by the Biden administration, in my view, they need to be proposals that people already think are good ideas, like maybe term limits, although there are worries about that being unconstitutional. But if it's adding more seats, that's going to create an immediate backlash. I think probably the Republicans would just take the Senate back quite quickly if that were proposed. So Biden said he wants to set up a commission. Hopefully the commission, if it gets created, will come up with some good ideas for what we can do. But yeah, our focus on the Supreme Court to do policy has been extremely deleterious. So I would agree with that.
Going back to the question of abortion and the question of whether one can talk it out, the standard thing that many political scientists say is, well, you can compromise on things that are quantitative. You want 0 and I want 100, let's compromise on 50, but you can't compromise on things like abortion. And I think that if you think of compromise simply that way, of course you can't compromise on things like abortion. It'd be like Solomon cutting the baby in half. But if you think about it in the way I was talking before, integrative negotiation that Mary Parker Follett invented, where you try to think about people's interests, you can think about the way the Italians handled the abortion. They got referendum making abortion legal. I think it was the 1970s. Anyways, quite early on. And the way they did it was they didn't talk about rights. They didn't talk about right to life. They didn't talk about a woman's right to control her body. They talked about tragedy. It's a tragedy to bring a child into the world that you can't support. It's a tragedy to kill even the teeniest little embryo that has the potential for human life. So how do you reduce the tragedy? Well, you make abortion legal. You say there has to be consultation period, that you have to wait, but all the clinics, all the little health clinics had abortion capacity, so that yes, there was a waiting period, but also you had easy access to abortion. So you were able to have the abortion way earlier than in the United States typically. And that reduces the tragedy. Now, that may not be something that would work in the United States, but the point is that there was a kind of listening to what was really important to people on both sides, and a result that came out that was acceptable to a majority of the Italian public and to the legislature way back quite early in the women's movement. So that's an example of how it's not compromise, but a way of trying to think through what's important to both sides.
Yeah, and on this issue, I think there's also the fact that most Americans are abortion moderates when they're polled. You know, most people don't want third trimester abortions legal. Most people don't. Most people do want first trimester abortions legal, and you go to second trimester and it's more split. And that is actually the agreement that countries, and I believe in like Germany, have reached. And so, you know, even if compromise kind of philosophically seems like a weird term to talk about moral issues as opposed to just pure economic dividing up money, right? But we actually do it. We sometimes just really figure it out.
Yeah, but I wouldn't use the word compromise. I'd use the word finding agreement.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, either way, that seems apt. Yeah.
So we've got some comments. After you finish speaking there, using the word tragedy, Jenny, Greta said, brilliant strategy, reduce the tragedy. Rita said, I agree. And then Shannon Keith said, how can we initiate civil discussion with those whose political alliances are twinned with their religious beliefs? Nothing scares me more than the idea of someone like Amy Coney Barrett being confirmed to SCOTUS and then imposing her model of chauvinism and misogyny on her decision-making process. Anyone want to take that?
Yeah,
How can we
I think
I too am very much against a very, very conservative Supreme Court justice. And it looks as if she might well be kind of knee-jerk in her reactions to things. Since she is going to, I think it's very, very likely that she will be confirmed. We do have some possibilities for changing the court. I agree with Kevin that that increasing the number is probably going to be extremely unpopular. But I would also hope, and I think it's probably true, that somewhere along the line, she will actually pay attention to the cases before her and actually pay attention to the questions before her. And it's possible, it's just possible. I think the chances are 1 in 100, but I think it's possible that she might begin to change her mind. That's all we can hope for. We've got ourselves into this fix of having a Supreme Court like this. And that's it. I don't see a way out of it other than, you know, drastic changes that the public's not going to come out with. But I agree, term limits, the public will support term limits.
Yeah, I think Republicans would accept it as well. You just have to frame it as the other folks will be out regularly. I would say, I think one of the difficulties of doing everything at the Supreme Court is that there really is reasonable disagreement about how to understand the Constitution and its authority. I mean, I'm a political philosopher and it's a gigantic question. So I think when Barrett or Thomas, they have a theory that I think is a reasonable view, but I think that the liberals also have a reasonable view. They're just reasonable disagreement. And the worry is that if the Supreme Court gets too lopsided, imagine Breyer were to pass away and a second Trump term replaced him, and then the court was 7-2 conservative. That would be very destructive for the country. Having a 5-4 majority on either side, that we can handle. We've seen that. A 6-3 majority, people are worried about that for stability reasons, and I admit I am too. But yeah, if we got to 7-2, I mean, I think, or suppose, I mean, just to take the extreme case, imagine we had 9 conservatives on the Supreme Court and no liberals. That would be a disaster for its legitimacy. So there needs to be some ability to see there as being a fair procedure for how people end up on the Supreme Court, and that it isn't just dependent on, you know, the fact that there were people stepping down and deaths, you know, so close together.
So we've only got 5 minutes left. So can I just pivot over to some more questions that this one came in earlier. Who is we? You presume that there was once an age that wasn't polarized and that trust has in some sense been lost, but this isn't true. Or is it perhaps only true for white elites? It's the white elites that are finally realizing their government and many of society's major institutions are lying. This is not new to Blacks. They've known this for a long time. Black populations have been alienated from the American dream, as they often phrase it. It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. So, who wants to take that?
Oh, there's a lot going on there. I mean,
Did we ever have a non-polarized and trustful? Well, we did. Your statistics were showing that we were less polarized, more trust.
Yeah, I think Jenny showed that pretty clearly, just briefly.
But we're in a very fragmented situation now.
Yes.
So how do we rebuild that? How do we get that trust back? How do we cement these alliances between people?
I think you've got to get the American people thinking about certain kinds of tough reforms, like having a more parliamentary voting system. I think it's just as long as, or Supreme Court term limits. I mean, there's so many things that don't work very well anymore about our constitutional system. And then I think the parties would respond to different incentives very differently. So I don't think it's just a matter of like waking up. I don't think people's preferences would necessarily, underlying preferences would change, but if they could be expressed through a political system that was more compromising. I mean, think about how wonderful it would be in the US if we had to watch the two parties go into coalition like we see in Europe. I mean, wouldn't that be so healing? Yeah, Republicans say, okay, the Democrats have to come on, and same underlying preferences, but we see compromise, and we see it all the time. So I don't know if we need to think about in terms of waking up in those terms. I mean, all of that's important, but we could even take the underlying preference structure we have now and do much better. So I think that's you know, something worth taking into account. Of course, with the amount of reverence we have for the Constitution in the country, that's tough to make changes.
Jenny.
I think the question of who we is incredibly important, and it's got to be very plural. Yes, we are many different kinds of people with conflicting as well as common interests, and that any political system has got to deal with that. Within the political system, some groups have completely not been treated equally. Obviously Blacks, obviously immigrants, obviously women, but more so with Blacks than any other group. And yet trust was high among Black people too, right after World War II. Trust in the government, whether or not the trust was misplaced, that's another question. But I think that we can recognize the plurality of our country, and nevertheless, by listening to one another, negotiate agreements that meet many people's interests. That's completely possible. You do it in business, you do it in your family, if you're a good, well-organized family, and we can do it in government. Even within any of those communities I mentioned, there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity. Every Black is not like every other Black. Every woman is not like every other woman. Deep conflicts of religion, of region, of the way you want to raise your children, huge conflicts. So we have to recognize those conflicts as we move forward.
So we're ending on a very optimistic note, which is quite good. I don't think people feel very optimistic right now about the election. There's the last point here. Someone has said, any comments on ranked choice and how it will tilt the election to the extreme?
Yes, I used to be an opponent of ranked choice because it tends to undermine parties. We have ranked choice here in Cambridge. But in the current situation where the structure is so polarizing, it's not a matter of just being nice, as I said before. The structure is driving us in a polarized direction. Ranked choice undermines polarization because the person who's first on the list might not get enough votes to get elected. So they're going to want some of those votes from the second. They're going to want second choice votes. And that means they can't demonize the other candidates because they want the voters from the other candidates to rank them second. It's a very anti-polarizing form of electoral system.
And I agree completely. In Trust in a Polarized Age, I actually defend ranked choice voting as one way of depolarizing. Now, you know, in Australia, say you still have two really big parties, although you do have lots of oddball senators that are their own deal. So you still will have two-party dominance, I think, to some degree. But it will be, and I agree with Jenny on this, that it will be, I think, depolarizing because of how you have to rank people, right? I mean, think about it. The Republican says, well, is the Democrat my second choice or the Libertarian? And maybe there's an election, one election, where people put Republican at the top or Democrat at the bottom and vice versa. And the libertarians are second. And then we have a libertarian government all of a sudden. Then the parties wouldn't let things get that way. But people would have to learn that, well, maybe I don't hate the other side so much. Maybe I'll put him second instead of first. So I agree with Jenny. Good question.
Well, there are a lot more questions. Of course, we could keep going. Unfortunately, we haven't got time, but I really think you've answered a lot of really interesting questions I had today. We didn't get into the history of the country, but that's also very interesting about how we've been in this predicament, maybe not quite so bad, but similar predicament before. So let's be very optimistic and hope that we have a just and fair election, which is my chief concern, I think. Okay, so I'm going to say thank you, Jane Mansbridge. Thank you to Kevin Vallier for making time for our forum this afternoon. And thank you to everyone for listening to today's forum. Thank you for donating. We're very grateful for the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute and the Mass Cultural Council. And anyone who'd like to donate, please feel free to go to the website, www.cambridgeforum.org, where you can find the podcast of this and all our other forums, as well as details of future programs. Okay, I'll see you all very soon. And thank you again for joining us today.